Welcome to the third episode of Toots Your Own Horn, a podcast series documenting the creation of a new kind of classical play festival featuring female playwrights. I'm Alex Karolyi, and I'm the artistic director of Shadowpath, a theater company that is researching and exploring how to produce this festival, which we have named Theater Out of the Shadows. Rather than reinvent the wheel, we wanted to invent connections to other theater festival makers who have presented female-focused work and learn from the experts what worked best and identify challenges. We begin close to home in Toronto with a female theater producer and creative mastermind, Claire Burns, who introduced Toronto audiences to a new kind of festival in 2018, celebrating female-centric performance work, otherwise known as the Feminist Fuck It Fest. What made your company or you want to produce this kind of festival?
Well, the company, it's definitely not just me for sure. Like, it was the company, and with so Sedna and I were, Sedna's the artistic producer of the company, and I was the managing director, and then Ben left, and so I became like managing artistic director, and we were just like, this seems obvious. Like, where the fuck are all the women's work?
So you really just saw a lack or a void, and you were like, let's do something to address that. And you got a great response, I think, from the artistic community.
Yeah, it was a fantastic response.
Okay. And so you don't know any festivals specifically for classical works by women?
I didn't know there were any classical works by women. Yeah, it's interesting because it's also like, as we re-examine classical, right, and all this shit's happening at the Shaw and at the Stratford, and it's like, okay, but is like typical classical like just like holding up like white supremacy, which like it basically is.
Oh yeah, it is. Yeah, like there's a lot of like triggering subject matter. You're just like,
oh, I went to George Brown. Like I did classical, and like it was all white guys. Like maybe we did a Carol Churchill, like scene study.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? But like nothing by women. Nothing.
Yeah. Is there something specific that holds you back from doing that festival again?
Honestly, I think if I could have a big budget to do it, I would do it. But I'm just very aware of like all the labor that women and trans folk do anyway. And so honestly, I don't want to do the unpaid labor of like applying for grants for everybody, right? Like I already felt like at the time of the end of this festival that I'd been like running storefront for almost 5 years. My art had not taken off the way I wanted, and I was just like servicing other people for theirs, right? I'm sure you feel that the same way.
I know exactly what I know. But I think that this is also like, for example, this discussion is a discussion that a lot of us could be having as one of the professional development components of why does it have to be like that? Like why do we have to work for free? And why does that mostly fall on women who are all of a sudden administrators with no previous training, just sort of figuring it out? And you're like, I don't know. Like, why is there that big gap of support because you and I and people like us, we're huge, or could be huge economy boosters for the arts and innovation industries, because we are creating jobs. And imagine if we had just a little bit more support, resources. I mean, yes, I agree, money, but even beyond that, like, other types of resources too, then just imagine how the industry would thrive. New York City is one of the highest producers of women's work, not on their main stages or on Broadway, but by independent theater producers and grassroots performance companies. We chatted with Gwynn MacDonald, the artistic director of Juggernaut Theater Company and the co-editor of the Women in Theater online journal. Gwynn was a driving force behind an initiative called The First 100 Years, the Professional Female Playwright.
I wanted to reach out to other people in the world that have possibly done something like this, that have sort of unearthed classical female playwrights and even brought them to the public forum. I was really happy to find that article and see that you've done some work like that. When did you start this festival?
I think it was 2002, 2003. It ran over a year. Susan Jonas is a Yale PhD dramaturg, among other things. She had just done a landmark report on the underrepresentation of women in theater in America. Both of us saw the immediate and obvious connection that if you don't know your history, you are constantly reinventing the wheel. So she was an early champion of the work. And it was going towards a good cause, which is, addressing some of the biggest deficits in our field. I started to do a lot of research and see that these women were fairly well known in academia. So I was like, we need to spread this out. We wanted everyone to get up to speed, to know that there were alternatives to She Stoops to Conquer. Okay, so Susan Jonas then continued to be involved in initiatives of gender parity and also seeing a stage that's as diverse as a New York City subway platform.
Mm-hmm.
It should include disability, it should include every ethnicity, it should look like the real world.
What was the format of the project like?
The project was in three parts. The first part was this launching symposium where we got theater companies that sent their people who were interested to come. And that was to give a lecture about the history. And so we'd get writers, academics who had written biographies of these women to tell us about them. So then we'd show that scene, where it's clear that this person did something that, Goldsmith later did. So everyone, points to him as being the person that pioneered this, but in fact, she did. So part 2 was the reading series that we now chose a playwright, and then different companies would do 4 of her works. And then the third part was a window installation at the Drama Bookshop. We took over a window. We had a 17th century dress made out of paper. I got the Shakespeare Folger Library to send me facsimiles of pages from, I think it was Centlever and another manuscript. So basically she was creating this dress out of a play. So it's great. You get to see the playwright's handwriting. We also did a really cool poster series. There's an image of shoes from the 70s, and it's Elizabeth Inchbald did something in the 70s, and then at the bottom it would say the 1770s. And the tagline was "Find out what else you don't know." And Afra Ben, we took an image of Emma Peel from the Avengers, and it was Afra Ben was a spy and something or other in the 60s. So it was a very 60s stylish image. And then at the bottom would be the 1660s. The poster series actually is what got us funding. If we had written an actual grant proposal, which we did, I think it just wouldn't have been as engaging as seeing these very powerfully well done images.
We then spoke with Melissa Riker from New York City's Estrogenius Festival, an annual arts festival founded in the year 2000 to support dynamic female characters while celebrating inclusivity and pushing gender parity in theater.
So it was begun as a short play festival in the West Village. Yep. With the goal to celebrate plays that could be written, new plays that were written with female characters that were dynamic and charismatic and referred to themselves or to other women or to the world in general without also having to be in reference to someone else.
Right.
Reference or deference to someone else. Mm-hmm. It was there, in 2000, there was a extreme lack of female characters on stage that female actors could be playing that had that level of depth.
Or even having two female characters talking to each other on stage
Right.
was very rare, you know?
Without it being some sort of competition over a third character that was not a female. And the plays, the reason that it was for new plays and short plays is just to challenge playwrights to create these characters. And to write these characters. And what does it mean to write these characters?
And all playwrights, like male playwrights as well? Or
Yes. Yeah. And that was also one of the founding elements, is that there was never actually exclusion involved. It was, can you celebrate women? And if you can celebrate women, can you celebrate the diversity and the multifaceted layers of women? And if you can do that, whether you're a man or a woman, or you identify somewhere in between, your play can be on the stage at Estrogenius. That has been part of our founding voice all the way through. This feeling of, if you are capable of this skill, you can be part of this community.
Right, so maybe all it takes in some cases is the correct prompt, right? For people to start creating work that has perhaps different perspectives.
There's a screenwriter who said, when he was asked how he writes such interesting, complicated women, he said he writes these women as though they're people.
Right.
That was the answer.
Who would have thought?
Right.
Yeah.
And not as an instrument in the storytelling, but actually as one of the people in the storytelling.
Makes sense.
So that's where it started, and that's where it was for many, many years. It was a short play festival where that was the challenge. And it was also about gender parity in directing and technical theater. And while it was wide open as to who could be the playwrights, the directors were always women. And there are multiple organizations that have since bounced off of Estrogenius. There's an amazing organization called Girl Be Heard that got its start in Estrogenius. And the organization that I'm still part of running, which is Women in Motion, is now a year-long commissioning project for female choreographers. So that's something wonderful that over time can start to happen, that these initiatives that start as ideas within a festival idea can start to be inspiring and grow off into projects that can then change the lives of so many women and girls.
Yeah. And so how did you use community engagement to connect residents in meaningful ways, if you feel like the festival does that?
One of the very simple things that we did that I love is we give all festival participants a free pass so they can see as many shows as they want to. And this was something that Eras said they do in their festivals. And I was like, well, are people really going to go to one another's shows? And they really did. And that was fantastic. And we always do an opening gathering where everyone can come. We've done a open mic, speak your mind version of that as we launch into the festival. And everyone gets their passes that night. So they meet one another and then they start to go to one another's shows.
What other festivals do you know of that mainly focus on classical female playwrights?
I will say, I don't know. When I was reading your questions, I thought, I don't know the answer to that question, and I don't know that I can even list classical female playwrights.
Next, we chatted with Tricia Mcdermott, the artistic director at Airmid Theatre, who also produced classical works by women.
Women have been producing plays potentially all the way back to the Egyptian period. My favorite part is a woman creates a play and it becomes a really big success, and then you'll see a lot of plays written by men that are trying to counterbalance that. And then unfortunately, the man's play becomes famous and the woman's play disappears. The one that I can say the most is, the two expressionist plays that everybody does. You have Sophie Treadwell's play, Machinal, and then you have Elmer Rice's play, which he did after her, which is the one that everybody tends to think of as the ultimate expressionist play, but he stole it from her. The company had already existed for a number of years by the time we started the festival. I think we were already 9 years old when we started the festival. And we'd been producing readings, and it was about 9 years of really finding work. So much of it was finding what was out there and uncovering it. So the whole idea of this started because I was annoyed that all these women that I knew weren't getting produced. That I had a female Broadway producer literally tell me women just don't write as well as men, and I wanted to kick her in the teeth. And the idea that we didn't have a future or a present because nobody knew we actually had a past. And collectively, women have made a huge difference on theater, whether it was as an unsung female writing the end of Brecht's plays, or A Man Today, or Madame Vestry, or all of these women who produced, or my favorite unknown work is the dismissal of what they used to call home theatricals that were done all over the world. And they were dismissed as, oh, just some woman producing a play in her backyard for her friends. Guess what? Half of those women were amazing playwrights, and they couldn't get produced publicly.
Which one is just about your biggest success with your festival?
I guess in the long run, what I always find the most successful is that we presented something that the audience learned from. Even if they had a great time, even if all they did was walk away and go, hey, I didn't know a woman wrote a play. I think we do our job and are most successful when we challenge somebody's view of things. And I think every play we ever did, because of the nature of it being a play by a woman on its own, but also because women took more risks, I find, whether it was a comedy or a drama, there's a different risk level and there's a different voice and it's heard differently. And I think when you challenge your audience, you always are successful.
So what was your biggest challenge or learning curve?
So the biggest challenge was marketing it in a way that made it contemporary, made it important, but didn't deny the classical nature of it. But I think the challenge is to get people to not hear a woman's play, let alone a woman's classical play, and go, I'm out. So you got to market it in a way that's like it's a new play.
Did you include community engagement and connect residents in a meaningful way?
I think theater is communion. And I think when we get insulated and think it's just us as professionals, we do a disservice to our work. Every night we did a show, I would have a community organization that we spotlighted. So there was a table as you came to the festival that was connected to some community organization that we wanted to spotlight. Connect your work to a community organization so that also makes people think of theater in another way.
Were you able to engage and support female identifying artists beyond the Playwrights? And if so, how did you accomplish this?
I think women can easily adapt to telling men's stories because we have to live in a man's world and we have to think that way. And I'm not saying that all men can't think that way, but I think women definitely come to women's plays in a relationship that might be closer to equals and equal experience.
Do you know of any other classical play festivals by women, like female classical play festivals?
I do not. One of my goals is to start getting this work in the hands of Shakespeare festivals all over the world. I want them to consider this work because they're leaving half the population out.
Melody Brooks is the artistic director of New Perspectives Theater Company in New York City and was a big part of establishing the On Her Shoulders project in 2013.
Back in 2009, there was a lot of movement around gender equity and parity for women theater artists here in New York. And I was one of the co-founders of something called 50/50 in 2020, Parity for Women Playwrights. And that's a grassroots thing, was never really an official, entity. But we came up with a list of 10 things that really needed to be done in order to address the gender parity issue. And one of them was reclaiming the history of women playwrights from the past. Because our tagline for On Her Shoulders is women have been writing plays for 1,000 years and nobody knows it.
We're trying to decide whether we should leave the scripts intact as they are and keep them, as authentic as can be, or whether we should, start to work with framing them more for contemporary audiences and then working with dramaturgs to make them more digestible.
You have to, but I don't think anybody does any classical work untouched because our format has changed. The Elizabethans went to hear a play, not to see one. And they were much more attuned to language, and they could sit through 5 acts that were highly repetitive, and modern audience just don't. Simply feeling a need to respect the artistic integrity. Not all the scripts are great scripts, and they can be made better by judicious edits. Have a separate page on your website if you want to give them access to the full script, to an unedited script. Well, I think that the question is, what's your goal? Is your goal to generate interest in these plays and get them produced, which is what ours is, and also redefining the classical canon. So again, what's the focus here? Yeah. Is it to, and I think there's no one particular focus because the range of the women writing is enormous. Right. The theatricality, certainly the 17th century playwrights who are, Afro-Ben and within that next 100 years, they were really, there's very little to separate them from their male contemporaries, except the men get put in the theater history books and the women don't. But they were earning their living as playwrights.
And then what challenges or learning curves did you come up against?
The challenges are always timing, right? Because we do everything on a shoestring. We're a very, tiny, poor company. And expanding the diversity of the writers, because that is a core new perspectives part of our mission. So really reaching beyond. And also, we don't want to do plays that everybody else is doing, right? So there are some of those 17th century women that everybody's doing now. Like we would never do Afro-Ben.
Right.
Because it's not our mission. She doesn't need us to promote her. We're trying to find more 18th century writers, which we're kind of shy on. And we're trying to do that balancing act and really digging to see what we can find pre-16th century.
Do you get any pushback from men at all?
In the past, we have, but not huge amounts. Part of our tagline in our mission statement says our aim is not to exclude, but to cast a wider net.
Oh, that's great. We're actually talking right now with libraries. So we're thinking of doing some virtual readings in partnership with local libraries. And then what they would do is actually get the plays. So they would seek out how to have the material in the library so that people can actually connect, if they want to actually read the play. It's because part of the issue, I say that one of the biggest issues is the accessibility of these plays.
Right, I agree.
So it takes a lot of work researching, but then you're lucky if these plays are online, which many are not. So I think even just, the fact that some of these libraries are very enthusiastic about taking care of getting the materials and then we'll come and do the actual theatrical.
No, that's brilliant. That's a great idea.
Yeah, I want to also work with school boards and try to look at getting some educational component attached to where is this work in the classrooms? Why don't we even know that female classical playwrights exist? And then of course, festival programmers, who's programming our main stages and why is the work so one-sided? It's
so interesting because the idea that why don't people know this, right? So my little tagline has now become, it's the first one or the only one or the earliest one that we know of.
I'm a big fan of of collaborating or just connecting, not doubling up work where, where we don't have to.
Right.
Why do everything alone when there's people that know more, have sort of done it or even started the work already, that I think we can do more together?
No, of course. And it's also been one of the things that has kept women back for decades, right? Is that the men have the old boys next work, and they're brought under the wing of some Broadway producer, and they advance much further, and women are left to fend for themselves. So it is also a big component of our work at New Perspectives, that we mentor a lot of young women. Again, a consistent refrain is, why don't we know this? One young woman said, I feel so cheated. Why wasn't I taught this?
Women at Plays is a festival of one-act plays written by Canadian female playwrights with female characters directed by female directors. This provides a creative outlet for female artists and showcases women of all diversities to audiences of all genders. We got the inside scoop from festival founder Marianne Sawchuck.
I started Women at Plays in 2005. I did it out of Vancouver first off. My husband's an actor as well, and I wasn't getting any calls. I had passed into this other age range. My husband was getting all of these calls, and I was just like, this is not fair. It was just ridiculous, right? So part of me was like, okay, I don't have the money to do any kind of film or whatever, right? But I thought, it would be really cool is we could put on some short one-act plays with my friends, and only women, because I was just pissed at not getting any auditions. And I'd look on the breakdowns of what my husband was getting, and it was just literally there's the girlfriend, and then there's a shop owner and the bimbo. You know what I mean? It was just. So I thought, well, this is a little thing that I can do, and I'd produced theater in the past, so that's how it started. So we had published plays from male and female, all female characters, all female directors. It went off really, really well. And I thought, I should make this an annual thing. So the next year I decided only female playwrights. And that's when my mandate changed at that point in time. It had to be all female playwrights, all female characters, all female directors. We actually broke the box office in January in Vancouver. We actually had to pull seats from the rehearsal on our closing night. So that was the third festival, and it went really, really well. At that point, I decided to have new works.
So you work as initially a performer and then a producer, and then also, are you a writer?
Nope. To be honest, I recognized right out of theater school. I could continue to pay for weekly classes to keep my skills up, or I could actually produce stuff and be on stage and do characters that I want to do. And so I did right out of theater school. I started producing almost right away.
What would you say then is your biggest success with this festival?
The biggest success to me was at Women at Plays 3 when we broke the box office record. It was also one of the most diverse festivals that I had done. I couldn't understand why no other producers understood that if you just put a big mix of people on stage, you get a bigger audience.
Would you say that your audiences are mostly female, or you think that they're pretty balanced?
They're pretty balanced. I think that men are willing to come out and support female artists, and that's truly amazing.
How did you include community engagement and connect residents in a meaningful way?
One of the actresses said, we should do a talk back, and I was like, oh my goodness, do we, when are we going to do this? But we ended up doing a talk back on the last night, which was the closing night at the International Women's Day. It was great. I was so happy that we did it. People were still there and asking questions and really, really engaged.
You also kind of answered this of what major company want to produce this kind of festival. You talked about women not getting work, changing sort of the characters that women are playing to be beyond the bimbo and
yes. And I mean, even still to this day, there's only 33% of female playwrights are being produced on professional stages across Canada. And why isn't it 50? 51 to be a matter of fact. To be exact, it should be 51%.
What other festivals, if any, do you know of that mainly focus on classical female playwrights?
Female classical writers that I've never heard of. You're the first. It's amazing. Why?
That's mostly, unfortunately, are a very common answer. From women that are well-versed in theater, in works by women, are still sort of saying they're not on main stages, they're not being educated in classrooms, and why?
Yeah.
So, because I mean, it's not that there's like, oh, a dozen that we don't know about, there's thousands, you know.
I just didn't think they existed.
That concludes episode 3 of Toots Your Own Horn, documenting the creation of a new kind of classical play festival. Next time, we'll review what truly shocked us about speaking with other festival makers, and review 9 more classical plays by women, evaluating their programmability for our Spring 2021 festival, Theater Out of the Shadows.